Thanks, Daniela. What's up? It's time for Catching Up with Carley, presented by Meijer. Today, I'm joined by graphic designer Todd Radom. Todd, for people who don't know, how would you describe yourself?
Well, I am a designer. I have created logos, uniforms for sports events and for teams for the last 30 years. Everything from the Super Bowl to individual teams, ticket designs. I'm also an author and a writer.
That's incredible. Long list. You got a good resume, and you're an admitted history fan as well. Can you give us a little history lesson on our classic Old English D and the winged wheel?
I would love to. These are two time-honored teams that have evolved a little bit over the years. As far as the Old English D is concerned, I love so much about it. I'm an East Coast guy, but I remember going to Tiger Stadium. I actually did the logo for the final season of Tiger Stadium in 1999. My goodness, last millennium. But the Tigers D, to me, connects the entire history of the franchise up to today. It predates the Tigers' time in the American League, back to 1896, when the Tigers were members of the minor league Western League. So that's a pretty amazing thing. It has evolved over the years. It's disappeared time and here and there, but it endures, much like Detroit itself. And the winged wheel is much the same. Almost 90 years of continual use. The Red Wings today look like the Red Wings of Gordie Howe, the Red Wings of the 90s. You can draw a straight line throughout their history, which is a pretty unusual thing.
Love it. And can I ask, what got you into this career path?
Wow. It's a long story, but I'll keep it short. I am a fourth generation artist. My father was a what I call a creative jack of all trades, was at various times a designer, a photographer, a copywriter, art director. His father, my grandfather, was an illustrator and fine artist. I have a brother who's a photographer. I have a cousin who's a jazz drummer. So the DNA runs deep. And I'm one of those kids that, I played sports, but I was never great at it. But I think because of that DNA, I always looked at a certain way. I observed the uniforms. I observed what was going on in the field, certainly. But I was looking at the logos and I was doodling logos. And all these years later, I'm involved in sports in kind of a different way.
That's awesome. And not only are you a graphic designer, but as you said before, you're an author. You have a book out called Winning Ugly, A Visual History of the Most Bizarre Baseball Uniforms Ever Worn. What made you want to write a book, and what can readers expect in it?
Well, I am a child of the 70s, and we had our share of flamboyant uniforms, different uniforms, experimental stuff going on in the 70s across sports, but baseball really, rose to the fore. You've got the Astros with their rainbow uniforms, the Padres in brown and gold, the Oakland Athletics winning 3 World Series titles in green and gold, the Cleveland Indians looking like giant Bloody Marys at one time. So this is a really loving homage to that era, but it's a history of the baseball uniform, goes right up to the present time. There's a little bit of Tigers in there. Of course, they've looked like the Tigers, like I said, by and large for almost their entire history. But really, like I said, more than anything, a loving homage to some of the most questionable uniforms ever worn.
So you touched on the Tigers. What are those Tigers references in that book?
As much as anything, I talk about the fact that the Tigers went off-brand a couple of times in their history. In 1960, the Tigers dropped the Old English D. There was a lot of hue and cry. They went with a script Tigers, one of the very few times in their entire lifespan that they have worn the team name across the front of the uniform. Well, that was dropped. The D was restored after 1 year. I also talk about a seldom remembered single game back in the mid-1990s when the Tigers wore a navy blue alternate jersey. It was supposed to be paired, believe it or not, Carley, with pinstriped pants. They wore white pants that day. But it wasn't so bad looking necessarily, but again, very off-brand for that ball club. It was mothballed after a single game, never to be seen again. And the Tigers still look like the Tigers despite that little experiment.
I love it. It's really interesting to see the progression. And speaking of Tigers, you created the 2018 Detroit Tigers season tickets. What was your vision behind creating those?
Well, again, an outsider here, but I know how special that ball club, that championship was to that city, how the players on that team at a time of great difficulty in America and in Detroit really brought the entire region together. I had a lot of help. My buddy Ron Wade, who was the marketing guy at the Tigers, pulled together a bunch of stuff. So looking at that and expanding upon it, I really explored the 68 Tigers, their players, their great moments, the World Series via illustration, typography, photography, and custom design. It was a really great project.
Very cool. And coming up in October of this year will be the release of your new book, Fabric of the Game, the stories behind the NHL's names, logos, and uniforms. What are some things you've touched on related to the Red Wings in that book?
So this is a book I've written with my friend Chris Creamer of sportslogos.net. And we look at every team in the history of the National Hockey League, including the Montreal Wanderers, who played a handful of games in the NHL's first season. Their arena burned down. They went out of business. But we looked at the Red Wings, and it was interesting, Carley, because, there's, on the one hand, there's not a lot to write about the Red Wings. Like I keep saying, they've looked the same for almost 90 years here. Mm-hmm. But we did look at the Detroit Cougars. This was the first iteration, the first name that the what we now call the Red Wings had. They were formed in 1926. They wore red and white uniforms those first couple of years. They then become the Detroit Falcons. And then in 1932, James Norris buys the franchise almost out of bankruptcy. He is the man behind the Red Wings logo, the winged wheel. He was a defenseman as a young man in Montreal back in the late 1890s. One of the teams that he competed against was the Montreal AAA, Amateur Athletic Association Winged Wheelers. And he was inspired by their logo, a winged wheel. He redrew it, tilted it on its side. Our logo endures.
That's incredible to learn the history of the logos. And now I have to ask, how important is a logo and a jersey to a sports team?
Well, you're talking to someone who thinks it's everything. And I always say that there are some teams that can tear things down, burn it down, start from scratch. There are some teams that really have to paint around the edges. When we talk about the Tigers and the Red Wings, these are two perfect examples of deep histories, fan bases that really embrace the old looks. It might not be the case, Carley, for younger teams. I'm thinking of the Jacksonville Jaguars might redo their uniforms every once in a while. A team like the Tampa Bay Rays, they've had several distinct looks in their 20-some-odd year history. But it depends on what the team is. There's so much equity. Our sports logos and uniforms connect generations. They are all about memories. Memories are currency. And I always say that our logos and uniforms, they connect fans in a way that, we're part of a tribe. And to be part of that tribe means that we gravitate toward these looks. Sometimes we hate them. Sometimes we want them redone, but we do care about them.
Absolutely. I agree with you completely. And you've also done artwork for things like the Super Bowl, the Big Three tournament, NBA and MLB All-Star games. Where does your inspiration come from? And are you usually given free rein to be creative?
It's a good question. I think every job is different. And I think that it really stems from the fact that I'm a fan and a consumer. And, let's face it, having this knowledge, having this interest in history. I always say I'm a history geek of all kinds, but sports history has really been something that I've gravitated towards since I was a kid. It gives me a little bit of a leg up. I love doing the research. Before, quote unquote, pen hits paper, doing that research, getting under the hood, seeing what makes a particular fan base tick, that's really job one.
That's awesome. And what do you think will be the next big trend in sports design?
I think it's about more. More is more. All of our attention spans are just so diminished. We have our faces and our screens, and that has really changed the way that we look at the world and the way we look at sports, of course. I think that it's really interesting. Over the last 5-10 years, our colors keep getting brighter. And I think that's a direct result of, again, all of us having our heads in our screens, of the in-arena and in-stadium experience, which you know this. It's all about LED lights. Those things are really, really bright, makes us look at things in a different way. And lastly, as far as the more part is concerned, look at the NBA. The last couple of years, you're seeing teams that are wearing, there really is no particular designation between home and road uniforms. Every team has multiple sets that they really swap in and out of. And I think that reflects our attention spans as well. So more is the watchword.
Got it. And what has been your favorite project to work on so far?
Oh, my goodness. I got a lot of them. Certainly having the Super Bowl under my belt is something that means that I'm part of the biggest one-day sporting event on the face of the earth. Otherwise, I'm a baseball fan, having been working with my friends at Major League Baseball for 30 years. A lot of memorable stuff there. And you referenced it earlier. I've worked with Ice Cube the last 4 years on the look of the Big Three, 3-on-3 professional basketball league. That's been a really interesting collaboration. Probably the most tight collaboration that I've had in over the course of my career. It's me and him. We kind of mix it up, chop it up. He studied architectural drafting as a young man, so he really gets it, and it's been a really fun collaboration.
That's amazing. Fun fact. Thanks for that. Well, this has been incredible to get to talk to you, and I really appreciate the time. It's been a pleasure.
Carley, thank you so much. Looking forward to better times together in stadium, in arena, and I'll be out there in Detroit. Thanks so much.
Love it. Thank you so much, Todd. Can't wait to link up when this is all done. And thanks for tuning in to Catching Up with Carley, presented by Meijer. Daniela?